So one of the things that we like to do with the Future of Music Coalition, and something that we're always thinking about, is how musicians and government can interact on a day-to-day basis at every level of government, from local to federal, building the kind of authentic relationships that allow people to get past an abstraction of a set of issues and really understand the ins and outs of the practical realities that musicians are facing in a really concrete way. One of the ways that we like to do that is just to bring people into conversation, and so we're going to be doing some of that throughout these 2 days. Today we've got Rebecca Gates, a musician and artist activist who's released 5 albums. 3 is leader of the critically acclaimed group, the Spinanes. She's toured internationally and performed as a vocalist on a whole bunch of records that you probably know by artists as wide-ranging as the Decemberists and Elliott Smith and Willie Nelson. Her most recent album, The Float, came out in 2012. It is a masterpiece and you really should own it. Today she's going to be talking to Jonathan Sallet, who is General Counsel for the Federal Communications Commission. I understand that they're going to tell us a bit about the story of how he got into this position and the path that brought him there, so I'm going to just sort of leave it there, and let's welcome them.
Technician to the rescue. Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks to those of you in the room and those of you who are watching online. I'm Rebecca, as Kevin said. Do you prefer John or Jonathan? Now you have to get your mic technique.
Either one is fine.
Okay, good. I always feel a little bit like Phil Donahue when I'm hand-holding a microphone. For those of you who are old enough to remember his show, very aggressive mic handling technique. But I'd like to thank John for coming here today. And one of the things that I would like to note at the beginning is that obviously I think the FCC is hard at work at all times, but there are a number of points that are under consideration at the Commission that are of really a lot of interest to the group of musicians and friends here at the conference. And so, in terms, how do you want to decline? I think it's basically important to say that there's a lot of things that we will discuss generally, which I'm really excited about, and some of the history and how the FCC works, but also in terms of on-point decisions that are under consideration, we're not really able to go into details. So, but I think that there's a lot of interesting things we can touch on. So one of the things that I was curious about is your professional path a little bit. Like, how does someone become general counsel of the FCC? Is that something you dream about as a child?
No, I didn't. So many of the things I dreamt about as a child, I'm too old to do now. So I, lawyer, of course, graduated from the University of Virginia Law School, clerked for a judge after that, and then for a justice of the Supreme Court, Lewis Powell, who was an associate justice of the Supreme Court. Practiced law for a long time in D.C., did other things, did a internet startup once that failed for lack of funding.
What year was that?
It was 2001, right when nobody could get financing. We went to try to get financing for what was an interesting business model that would have protected consumer privacy, but nobody was.
Maybe you should try that now.
It's possible. But I suppose the path that took me here was that I worked for Al Gore in one of his early presidential campaigns in the late 80s. He was very interested in technology and in the early days of high-speed networking. Through that work, I took a job at the Commerce Department in the Clinton administration and worked with Gore and others on what became the Telecommunications Act of 1996. That led to work I've done in policy and law on the nature of networks. And what the FCC does is networks, right? The networks can be over the air like radio or television. They can be over the air like cellular or Wi-Fi. They can be running through the ground, fixed fiber, copper, coax. But the core focus of the FCC is on networks. And through different avenues I've taken, practicing law, being in government, I worked for for anybody who remembers what long distance telephone service was, I worked for MCI in the 90s. It's always come back to networks, and it's come back to competition and innovation. And this job, heading the Office of General Counsel, lets me advise commissioners. I know Commissioner Clyburn was here earlier today, on the policies and the legal underpinnings of the things the Commission can do in these areas.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that process?
Sure.
How that works?
Yeah, it comes up in various ways, but basically it all has this in common. Issues that come in front of the Commission can come up as what's called rulemakings. They can come up as adjudications, right? A rulemaking is, let's make a policy. Well, the open internet proceeding is a rulemaking. But sometimes issues come up as adjudications. Parties are asking, that might be a television license renewal. It could be a merger application. But in any event, the Office of General Counsel does a couple of things. We advise the commissioners on the legal bases for decisions, right? So
precedents and things like that.
Precedents, what the statutes mean, what discretion Congress has given us. There are other parts of the Commission that are the policy bureaus. What we do is offer opinions on what the law allows or might not allow. And then when the Commission makes its decisions, we go to court if somebody challenges us, right? So if somebody takes the FCC to court, it's the Office of General Counsel that represents the FCC. And then the third thing we do is we have something that's called the transactions team, which works on mergers. So for example, we have a steering committee of which I'm chair that's reviewing the pending mergers. And that includes the other parts of the agency which are fundamental to this, who have the policy expertise in broadband or video programming or whatever else is involved.
How do you determine with the evolution of technology, and I mean, obviously anyone who's been alive for even a short period of time, we've dealt with very quickly changing technology. And I think one of the things that's always interesting to me is not only implications on culture and behavior and potential, but also the fact that law is, you have things that are based on history, you have a very slow-moving process, a very considered process. And I'm curious, even just what you just said, like there's all these, there's a technology component, policy component, judicial component, and it's interesting to think, how do you all, what's sort of the flow back and forth of that, and how much foresight or hindsight do you balance?
It's important, the question, because we're in a time where things are moving fast. There's a lot of change. Nobody sees the future perfectly, right? But we're trying to make governmental decisions, the FCC is, governmental decisions that will operate in the future even though we can't tell what the future is like. So there's two big ways one could go. One could adopt very certain rules, just bright lines. That has the advantage of letting everybody know what the story is.
And in terms of specifics or just in terms of?
Specifics, we could say this is okay, this is not okay, within our statutory authority. The good thing about certainty is everybody knows. The bad thing about certainty is it can become obsolete extremely fast. Or we could do what lawyers are taught to call the common law approach. You decide it case by case. That's what the English common law courts did for hundreds of years. Good thing about that is it's very flexible, right? If you get a new set of circumstances, if you get some new innovation nobody's thought about, well, you have the ability to consider it. Bad part of it is just what you said. People don't know exactly what their conduct should be, and it can take a long time. So a good deal of the philosophy of trying to put together a commission decision is how to balance certainty and flexibility. Because either one by itself leaves something to be desired.
That's fascinating. I think.
Thank you.
But and so in terms of like, what do you, I mean, thinking a little bit about the history of the FCC, and when was it? When did it become a formal
1934.
commission? Okay.
There was a predecessor agency in the 20s, but the current commission was established in 1934.
And was the FTC about the same time, or?
FTC
I mean,
was 1914.
Okay. Oh, okay. So I think that, I mean, that's always a really, to out myself as a potential complete nerd, that's something that's also really fascinating. I was fortunate to meet one of the FTC commissioners in August, and also the ways that they're balancing what you're talking about, the past, the future, the structure, leaving room for innovation. I think that, I don't know, there was, what kind of core, was there at the time that the FCC was implemented or set up the way it normally, or it currently operates, were there sort of core principles that were established at that time?
There were, but let's go back a step.
Okay.
Even to the FTC, right? The FTC comes out of the progressive era in American politics, right? That's what leads to the creation of agencies like the FTC. And the FCC is one of those. In other words, the idea is we want somebody to be expert in something. We're expert in communications networks. That was a view about how politics and government ought to work, that there were certain issues that specialists would be good at. So when the FCC was created, the first problem was simply in the 1920s, right, radio stations broadcasting in an unlicensed way would interfere with each other. So listeners couldn't hear anybody. There needed to be some system to make sure that there wasn't radio interference. That's what established, well, the stations like where I grew up, WBZ, right, which one could hear all over the East Coast because it had a clear channel, as well as the other allocations around the country. But what soon thereafter happened, 80 years ago this year, the Communications Act, was that the commission was given a set of responsibilities, for example, over the old Bell networks, the regulated monopolies, to ensure that the public interest, convenience, and necessity was served. That's the statutory language.
Can you say that one more time?
Public interest, convenience, and necessity.
Okay.
That's our job. We're supposed to be the specialists who apply the congressional mandate to communications networks.
I'm happy to be talking with you right now. Things are becoming more clear all the time. Well, you know, it's interesting because I think the way that I first heard about the FCC was I was involved in college radio. Yeah. And so we were, you know, the 7-second rule. That was mostly, it was like they were, the only reason they really heard about it is if something went wrong, there was a complaint, and then you had to deal with it. How did you first hear about the FCC?
Well, same way. I was an undergraduate at Brown University in the 70s. And there was a radio station that had a commercial FM license, WBRU, or as we used to say, WBRU 99.5, slightly left of center on your radio dial. That's what we would say. And I had the job, because nobody else wanted to do it, of doing the 6 a.m. DJ slot, 6 to 9 a.m.
We've all been there.
Right, and we weren't on 24 hours a day, so somebody had to turn the transmitter on. So I took a Greyhound bus to Boston one day and took the examination to get an FCC third-class license, which is what one needed to be able to turn the transmitter on. The transmitter was cool, like we loved it. We had one problem when I was at WBRU, which was we had a transmitter, it was a 20,000 watt transmitter on top of a science building, and we got FCC approval to go to 50,000 watts. We were like really excited about this. The only problem with it was, after we turned it on, it turns out that the monkeys in the lab who had electrodes in them started playing rock music during all the science experiments. The signal was so strong, it went through every scientific instrument.
So they became like FMC.
Correct.
Sorry, FM.
That's correct. And this was after the monkeys had become popular as a group, so people thought it. So we had to scale back to 20,000 watts. But
that's amazing.
It was fabulous. But so that was the first time I encountered the FCC, right? And thought about it. But the other thing I did in college as a political science student because I was interested in radio, and I also did news on WBRU, was to learn about the legacy of people like Edward R. Murrow, right, who had taken very courageous stances on very unpopular issues in the 1950s, and who had demonstrated the power of broadcasting. So both from the music and the news angle, it seemed to me that communications was fundamentally important. And I didn't think at that point that I might end up with a job at the FCC, but I was thinking about the FCC, I was thinking about its policies, and I suppose in some sense, you know, past was prologue, and I ended up in this job.
It's, in terms of, can you speak a little bit about the evolution of the FCC as the new technology? We touched on that a little bit, but you know, it being radio, it being TV, and now broadband, rural broadband, wireless. It's just been, I imagine, this explosion of networks to cover.
Let me give you two perspectives on it. The chairman of the FCC, for whom I work, Tom Wheeler, and the reason I actually have the job, which is that he was kind enough to offer it to me, has a theory about network revolutions. 4 great network revolutions: the printing press, the railroads, the telegraph, and things like the telegraph, TV, radio, telephone, and the internet. And that each one of these sort of destabilize society and allow improvement in better ways. And each time they come along, some people are afraid of the change, and other people embrace the change. And that what the core mission, as he defines it, of the FCC is to preserve the values that exist without regard to the technology, right? So we want competition, we want free expression, whether it's copper or radio or TV or fiber. Those are values that run through successful network revolutions. So we're in the middle of the internet revolution, right? The internet was privatized in 1995. It's not that old by historical measures. It's even today changing rapidly, right? We don't think it's at its mature last state. So the chairman talks about the mission in terms of preserving these values: public safety, competition, free expression, the way networks connect to each other, in order to help speed the internet revolution to ensure consumer acceptance of it.
And then in terms of when he talks about competition, or we could talk about it from his perspective of the moment, or in more general historical terms, like who is the person, what does the entity look like who's a competitor when you're drafting decisions? Like,
so I was an antitrust lawyer before I came to this job, so this will give me a chance to use obscure jargon, but I'll try to
please some
do
of
it in English.
The lawyers in the audience.
I'll do the dumb musical analogy. Beatles and Rolling Stones, direct competitors. So if legend is right, McCartney and Jagger used to talk to each other and make sure they didn't come out with a new single on the same date, right? They didn't want to be competing with each other. This is what's called an antitrust violation in some contexts. Not that one, I'm sure. But right, they're horizontal competitors. You just think of them, you might go see the Beatles, you might go see the Rolling Stones. But there's also, that's a horizontal relationship. There's also what's called a vertical relationship between buyers and sellers, right? Same metaphor, labored though it may be. Kids who wanted to listen to rock and roll in Britain in the late 50s had to listen to, or early 60s, Radio Luxembourg. The upstream provider in England was not playing rock and roll.
Right.
So the question is, today, when one thinks about competition, how does one think about both horizontal and vertical? And they're both important, right? Horizontal would be the kind of merger that AT&T and T-Mobile proposed. Two companies competing against each other directly wanted to merge. The kind of issues that the Commission faced in the Comcast-NBCU merger also involve vertical questions. if a last mile network has a company that's upstream, content provider like NBCU, to what extent might that be unfair, the merger, to other content providers? That was the basis of conditions in the Comcast NBCU. When the commission, I'm not talking about mergers now for a moment, but when the commission looking at competition, it's looking at both. It's looking at not only who's a direct competitor, say, to a broadband network, but, and this is very important in the open internet context, it's looking at what is the impact potentially on the upstream players, the content providers, edge providers, e-commerce providers, musicians, artists, who want to get across the broadband pipes to their audiences.
In terms of, I mean, there's a term that's thrown around now, or not thrown around, the term that's, how did we just not say, can I be partisan? No. Basically, no,
let me say it this way, one of us can be.
Okay. I'll take on that role. No, but in terms of thinking about well, I'll speak for myself. You know, I self-release a lot of my, I do all my business myself. One of the reasons I became involved in these issues and being more active in infrastructure as a musician is because I feel like not only is it something that I'd like to be involved with as a citizen and be engaged in that way and make sure that there's an open access and make sure that, and this is the term I was referring, was like it's non-discriminatory and things, how big do we have to, but what I wonder sometimes is how big do we have to be considered a competitor? You know, if the bulk of the competitors are huge corporations or corporations who, in terms of content, or corporations who have been given the authority to build the actual infrastructure and network and broadband and the cables and tunnels and wireless, you know, it's a huge network, and I would never consider myself to be one of them in terms of capital. But I think that it's this interesting thing that you all have to navigate, where there is this sort of cultural, philosophical, citizen-based infrastructure, open. If it, you know, in my opinion, if it's open, then anyone can do what they need with it, as opposed to trying to gain access to something. And some of that is highly philosophical, and some of it is partisan, and then some of it is very granular. And I don't really know what your thoughts are about that very wide-ranging statement. But
let me talk about how the Commission sees innovation and openness, because I think it helps answer that question. Think of three players. There are edge providers, anybody, right? An edge provider, anybody, content provider, musician.
Can you explain
artist.
edge provider?
Sure.
Just for
it could be anybody who uses a broadband network to reach consumers, right? So if you have a YouTube channel of your own, that's an edge provider. If you're Google, that's an edge provider. If you're Hulu, Amazon, if you're an individual artist or merchant using the broadband, using broadband networks, an edge provider is somebody who is engaged in commerce or expression with consumers. So the way we look at it is edge providers need to get through broadband networks to get to consumers. They should all have the same interest, right? The more edge providers who get to consumers, the more consumers need broadband, the better that is for broadband companies. But what the Commission found in 2010, and what a court upheld earlier this year, is that the broadband networks might not recognize that all the time. And they might have the incentive to draw a line or to otherwise impede edge providers from getting to consumers. And that's bad for consumers, and it's bad for all of us who want broadband to be deployed, right? Because it limits demand for broadband. It's what the court called the virtuous circle. So
poetic.
As courts go, So the answer to your question is everybody. In other words, it's not the technical answer of who is technically considered a competitor to a broadband network. The question is, whose presence helps enhance this virtuous circle? It's everybody's presence. Anybody who wants to use the internet to get to consumers, to engage in discussion or commerce or artistic expression with them, they're a part of what drives broadband. So the Commission has taken a very expansive view of the presence of such people.
And also in terms of other networks. I mean, is it something that translates conceptually across to not just broadband, but...
As I said to you before, our core statutory requirement is to act to further the public interest, convenience, and necessity. We are very open. We solicit public comment. We want to hear from public. So in other circumstances, whether it's merger reviews or license renewals or rule makings, we are open to and we want to hear from people about how their interests would be impacted or how they think the nation's interests would be impacted by the decision that's in front of us.
Yep, which brings up something that we talked about before that I wanted to touch on too, is that I think that specifically with a lot of the issues under consideration and with new technology, I know that FCC opened up comments for data analysis, data viz, for, I don't know if it's still up or if it was just a period of time. So your thoughts, having been there and having been in other, played other roles around technology and innovation, like what is, I find it very heartening that there's outreach happening in terms of how can we have citizens, be actually engaged in the process. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about maybe not only the process of that, but the impact of some of the comments, the numbers of comments. I know that there's been so many comments filed specifically around a lot of the Section 706, Title II, and all that. But at the end of the day, you see how many people are watching, millions of people are watching a football game and that on television, and that number suddenly seems small. Like, do we have that kind of impact? Do citizens, just feedback in terms of that? And then specifically in terms of artists, because you have that sort of, you definitely have a love for music and awareness of it. And we'll start, I won't pile too many questions on.
No, let me try to do both. In the open internet proceeding, I think Commissioner Clyburn said this, we've gotten almost 4 million comments. That's a lot of comments, right? And they're very important to us. And here's one of the reasons they're important. This is a historical point of view. 1970s, when I was on college radio, it was a big technology revolution. For the first time, people could buy a telephone and plug it into the telephone network. They could buy their own telephone. This was considered like unbelievably dramatic, and it led to a big market in phones that looked like ducks and quacked.
I think we had a Mickey Mouse phone for a little while.
Exactly. Because until then, there was a regulated monopoly, and one could not even connect other equipment to the network. That was a time when consumers had virtually no say over what happened. We then got to a point, late 80s, 90s, when I was at MCI, where there was competition of a kind, right? Some of us remember long-distance competition. That was great. For the first time, consumers could choose. But the regulatory issues were still pretty narrowly gauged. The 3.9 million comments demonstrate to us that the internet revolution has brought to individuals a personal relationship with the technology that's so important that they want to take the time to let us know what they think. That is a huge change from 40 years ago. A change from the regulators deciding what's best, or a regulated monopoly making decisions, to individuals having such personal connections to the technology they use that they are passionate about how issues get decided. That's incredibly important, right? And that is very helpful to us. We've gotten almost 4 million comments. We've done a series of open internet roundtables on different issues in different ways. We are collecting additional comments. We're meeting with people. I mean, you and I met last spring, right? Because you came in with other artists to talk about exactly this issue. That's part one. Part two. Of course, we're looking for good ideas. If a single person has a good idea, that's a great thing for us, right? But that's what we're looking for. And so, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about this before we get done in terms of artists, but what it does mean is when people come to us, the more they've thought about how it can work, what the practical implications are, what's the good idea, the better helped we are. Because what we're doing as commission staff right now is sifting through what we've heard from everybody to try to understand what the different options are to the commission as it makes its final decision on open internet, for example.
I don't know if this can be a quick point, but one of the things that is interesting is it also seems like part of the process right now is that the FCC is determining its own purview. Is that possible? I mean, or is there a situation where with each decision that gets crafted or is considered that there's a redefinition of authority in a sense?
Well, we can only do what Congress has allowed us to do, right? But there are places where Congress has given us discretion. Here's an example. I gave a speech a couple of weeks ago. There's a technical definition of something called an MVPD, a package of linear TV channels. The Commission is thinking about updating that so that internet companies would qualify if they wanted to. So if somebody wanted to put together a package of TV-like channels and use the internet as a transmission path, they would have the right to do that. And it would give them certain rights to negotiate for or to obtain programming. Well, if the Commission concludes that we have the discretion to do that, then it would seem to make sense to update our definitions to allow consumers more choices of more different kinds of video programming, right? That's a good thing for consumers. Consumers may like the bundles they get now, they may want different bundles. Not our place to decide which ones they like or don't like. Right. But if we can update our definitions in light of innovation so that more choices are available to consumers who might want certain kind of programming and not others, then there's a powerful argument in favor of doing that. So always within the limits of what Congress has said is our discretion, the Commission can think about how to keep current with innovation in order to get more competition into the marketplace. And I wanted to say, because I'm a former antitrust lawyer, competition is something I've been talking about, but free expression is an important value that the Commission relies on as well.
I like hearing that. And I think one of the things that also about specifically the net neutrality and open access issues is that I feel like it's often framed in terms of consumers, which is absolutely valid. Citizens are consumers, but as someone who is a member of the perhaps poorly named creative class and sees the implication, I think I'm always curious about sort of what we talked about in terms of what citizens with that skill set can bring to this process that's of value, and then also sort of redefining the issue at hand. I find myself in conversations frequently reminding that as important as it is for people to be able to get access to their Netflix at whatever speed, and again, we're back on one issue, but it's as important for anyone who is making a film or making an album, or to not only reach fans and have sort of unencumbered access in that sense, but also the uploading of culture, like that kind of sharing of culture, even in the radio sense, like how effective and beautiful and wonderful and personal like broadcast and networks can be, and life-changing. And so how to maintain that sort of fluidity and like robustness in a agora, if you will, that requires regulation.
Well, you've asked a couple of times about engagement. So let me talk about engagement, because from my perspective, what's helpful to me? What's helpful to me is to understand not just the passion people have for an issue, but what they think of the practical notions of how that passion should be translated. So here's my musical metaphor. It's the best I can do. So you know, because you've been in my office, that I'm an extremely amateur musician, but I write songs for hobby, right?
I haven't heard you play yet, so you might
Correct.
be sneaking on that.
I don't think so. But I work with professional musicians, and there's a guy, Derek Chafin, who's a producer in Philadelphia, and he's producing demos. We're doing demos of songs I've written. It's fun. So we were in the studio a couple of weeks ago with a singer, and there was one measure of music, a whole note. I had written it in C, high C, over an E minor chord. The singer wanted to sing B natural. I said I wanted it in C. I wanted it to be a sixth, not a fifth. They then went off into a long conversation, which I could barely follow because I'm not a singer, about how to get to that note, how to come off the other note. I didn't have to know everything they knew, and I never will know everything they know. But I had to know enough to understand why the tone I wanted was different than the tone the singer first preferred. They're only a half-step difference, but sounded different to me.
Yeah.
So if people come into my office, I don't expect them to know detailed legal theory. But it's good if they can talk about how policies have practical impacts. It's sort of the metaphorical equivalence of that discussion about the difference between a sixth and a fifth. Because we are in a position of having to hear from lots of people, and the commission, not the staff, makes decisions. If people can come in and say, not just why it's important, but what is going to be the benefit if it's done? What's going to be the harm if it's not done? What are other people saying? And why should you think a certain way about what other people are saying? It's not our goal to turn everybody into a legal scholar or a wonk, but the more people can engage, just the same way in which I need a certain amount of knowledge to be able to talk to Derek, the more people can engage in ways that we understand the issues, I think the more effective advocacy is.
That's great to hear. I agree. And I think one of the things in closing that you touched on and that I have been thinking so much about over the last couple of years is the effect that culture and creatives and culture makers and network users that we bring to whether it's just mediating something that's become problematic, or whether it's inspirational, or whether it's expositional, offering different perspectives. And I think thinking in terms of the power of musicians and the power of music, I really appreciate what you just shared, because there's a lot of highly skilled people who have a really interesting perspective, and I always feel like it's when you look at government or you look at some of these huge questions, it just seems like, as a person I met in the desert last week said, it's just pissing up a rope. And I think one of the things that I love about how you think about it and talking to some of the people on staff is that there's a value of our perspective and there's a value of our culture that's not always, to use a pun, broadcast.
Right. I mean, look, I talked before about the fact that expression is a value that's important to the Commission. It's in our statute. It's one we think about. That's the expression of ideas in a political context. It's creative expression as well. The mandate of the FCC is broader than that of some other agencies. We're allowed to consider these issues. We need help in thinking about how these issues translate into policy, right? Because people who are making music today, I understand it's not always the easiest thing to pursue, right? It's difficult. The economics aren't always good. The ability to reach your audience is a fundamental one, both in terms of commerce and creative expression. we can always use help in understanding better how we should think about those kinds of issues. Because it's easy for lawyers and economists to think about the economic circumstances that exist, or there might be outcomes of decisions. We need more help in thinking about how to integrate issues of expression into what we do. And music, look, you know, I mean, the chance to come here and be in a room with musicians is fabulous for me, right? It's what I love to do.
You're welcome.
And it's so much a part of people's lives. I think, and the Future Music Coalition remedies this, I think music is not always top of mind in policy. And so conferences like this organization, plays a very important role in making sure people understand the concrete way that policy can enhance music as a form of expression.
Thank you for saying that. I think one of the things also, as a finishing, just as we finish up here, I know that you got some insight when you were here at FMC a couple of years ago, and we don't have a ton of time, but if you could share that story as we finish, that would be great.
So I started, like everybody else, you know, my age, taking up a hobby. I started writing songs a few years ago, but I was saying to you before, the critical moment came actually when I was sitting in one of, I don't know, about the 6th row up there. I was doing a public policy project with T-Bone Burnett, who was sitting on this stage doing in basically this format. So he invited me to come with him, which was, I thought, incredibly cool. And he was sitting here and he said, the difference between what you do is you're professionals, and what other people are amateurs. And amateurs are great. It comes from the Latin word for love. They love the music. It's a fabulous thing. It's different than what we do as professionals. That was actually a very important moment for me, right? Because it made me understand that I could be an amateur musician and not be judged by the standards of what would be great professional work. I'm not that good, but it's important to me. It's an important means of expression. I do it all the time. And T-Bone, sort of by putting him into two different categories, sort of freed me up to be as good a musician as I can be without expectations. But the flip of it was, he was making a point, as I understood him, about what professionals need. And what professionals require out of a marketplace to be able to make a living. That's just that the other side of that coin is important to us, important to me at work. Even as the first side, the amateur side, is important to me on weekends when I'm playing bad piano.
I love that. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your work, and to everyone at the FCC for thinking through these big questions. And I don't know what's coming up next, but something interesting for sure.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you.